guys for powering through the end of a really long day about the imagination, about our calling, what it means. Before we begin, I would like to start with a prayer that I told people at dinner someone sent me today. And it is from, and I'm going to get the name wrong, I'm Texan. And so no matter how many languages I've studied, I can't say any words in any language correctly. So St. Philaret, anyone know? All right, I'm sorry, St. Philaret, that I just probably butchered your name. But we're gonna start with his prayer. It's a 19th century prayer, and he was a Russian Orthodox saint. So let's begin with his words to form us as we prepare to listen to these words. Lord, help me in all things to rely upon your holy will. Bless my dealings with all who surround me. Teach me to treat all that comes to me with peace of soul and firm conviction that your will governs all, in all deeds and words. Guide my thoughts and feelings. In all unforeseen events, let me not forget that all are sent by you. Teach me to act firmly and wisely without embittering others or embarrassing others. Give me the strength to bear fatigue that comes with each day. Teach me to pray you yourself. Amen. I think Dante is a great starting place for the Christian imagination. And for those of you who do Western Civ at OBU, you know Dante, right? And so it's a great place to start. Dante is responding to injustice, personal injustice, political injustice. He's responding to anger that he feels within him, not by responding with anger back, with defensiveness, with woe is me that this happened to me, not with a political pamphlet that attacks the current regime, not by leaving the church and saying, forget you or to hell with you, which is what he did to some of them, but not all of them. He stays within the church. And what he does is courageous response through imagination. And that kind of creativity persists. And 700 years later, this is the 700th anniversary of his death. 700 years later, the fruit we are still reaping from his sacrifice, to not allow his own ego to respond maybe the way he would have wanted, but to respond with a poem about love, about hope, about ascent. When you get into Paradise, which is probably the most difficult of the three to read, but one of the things that I love that it shows us and teaches us about imagination is when we get to Paradise, you have this great realm of wisdom. I'm just going to use one example. We could spend hours just talking through Dante and Christian imagination, but I'm only going to just focus on one example to get us started. You look in the realm of the wisdom, and they are floating around the sun. The different souls are. And there's this dance between them. I'm going to keep in mind this metaphor of the dance. And it's two different circles. One of the circles seems to have this theme of the scholastics, the thinkers, the intellectuals, those who followed St. Dominic. The other group seems to be those that are more like St. Francis, the Franciscans, the feelers, those with heart, those who love experience in the church. I'm reducing them a little bit for the sake of the example right now, because I'm not teaching you a class on Dante. So keep that in mind, all you scholars who might start attacking my analogy of Dante. But generally, that's what we have, is these two circles that seem to be about this heart, this imaginative affect that led them to Christ and imitating Christ in that way, and the intellectual. And what's interesting about these two spheres as they're circling one another, Dante always has the privilege to get to speak to one in each ring. And in one ring, he actually talks to St. Thomas, who doesn't lift up the life of Dominic, in whose order he actually followed, right? He was a Dominican. He was a scholastic. That's what everyone knows Thomas for. You also have to remember, right? He's writing about Thomas before Thomas was even cool when he's writing this. But Thomas talks about the life of St. Francis. And in the other sphere, you actually have, is it Benedict, who talks about not the life of, is it Bonaventure? Bonaventure, who talks about the life of Francis. He actually talks instead about Dominic. It's this powerful example of the reciprocal dance between the intellect and the imagination, about the necessity within the church that cannot do without the two, and does not see them as separate spheres in which you either go to a church that really likes preaching, they tell you the word every single week, right? Or you go to a church, we're all about the heart, we do really good things within the community. And you have this division. Instead, it's a recognition of the two intertwined, the dance that will take place in paradise. And for Dante himself, he studied with both. If you go to Florence, you can actually see the two different schools of thought in which he was studying underneath both of them as a student, getting to understand this reciprocal relationship. I think most of our great Christian imaginaries, people like, I'm going to start with C.S. Lewis, understood this relationship between the two. C.S. Lewis, if you've read his Surprised by Joy, Hans, Surprised by Joy, it's his story of how he came to Christianity. And so when people read it, they've read Mere Christianity, they're expecting this apologetic that is going to lay out for them, here's the reasons that I started believing. And they were completely let down by this book. Because what does he actually do? He begins by saying, when I was a kid, I loved Squirrel Nutkin. And it just throws people. What is he doing? Well, like a good medievalist, right? Someone who studied Dante, he understood the relationship between imagination and the intellect. And so he starts taking you through his own journey to becoming a Christian, beginning in the imagination. The way he would have understood it would have been medieval. You have an outer ring of imagination. You have a more inner ring of intellect, and in the very middle you have the will. So these three circles, right? So for him, he spends 200-something pages on the imagination and how God was speaking to him through his imagination. So he talks about Squirrel Nutkin and how he sensed autumn. He talks about a box garden that his brother Warnie made, in which he couldn't have explained it at the time, but he felt something Edenic. He recognized something Edenic in this box garden. He has these glimpses of joy, these glimpses of longing for something that he can't yet, with his intellect, explain what it is. But it's what draws him towards God. Don't you think it's fascinating that the imagination becomes the way that God is able to speak to C.S. Lewis? Now, for someone who, especially at that time, knew Lewis, you know him as a great apologist. He does have the reasons for his faith, and at least maybe 10 pages is dedicated to the intellect when he gets there. But in his mind, they were two different spheres for a very long time. I'm going to use one quote by Lewis. He says, the two different spheres were so separated. On one side was the many islanded sea of poetry and myth, and the other a glib, shallow rationalism. Nearly all I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. For him, it was the joys of literature versus the empirical. It was the poetry versus the facts. It was this division. The gods and heroes, he says, versus the atoms and evolution and military service. They had become separated in the modern world. And of course, this is the world that we now experience, is the separation. But as he studied the tradition, he saw that it had not always been that way in the church, that these things were connected. And that this world he saw in the imaginative life did not need and actually should not have been separated from his intellectual life. Why was it that the imaginative world was able to speak to him more than the intellectual side could at first? What brought Lewis to Christianity was a book, a story. For those of you familiar with Lewis, it was Phantastes. How many people have read Phantastes? Okay, I'm not a huge McDonald's fan. I teach a bunch of things that I realize are good, and preferentially, I'm kind of hesitant sometimes. And that's a preference thing. I love O'Connor. I love it when people die and when there's violence and shock. I love McCarthy. I love the raw realness of things. I just can't get enough of it. And Phantastes is a little ethereal for me. But if you've read the book, I can understand why Lewis would have been drawn to it. You have this character who walks into fairyland. But he doesn't just walk into it like an escapist, as we heard Dr. Noble talking earlier. Though also Lewis and MacDonald and Tolkien wouldn't have had anything against escapism. They said the only people who were against escape were prison guards. Right? So the idea for literature to be an escape was actually a good thing because it's escaping from the modern version of things, which tells them that things are empirical or tells them the rainbow is just these molecules. And they were escaping into a narrative in which the rainbow could have adventure to it, could have treasure at the end of it, could be a promise from the divine creator. Those were the myths that they longed for. I'll talk about that a little more in a second. But for Lewis, when he entered Phantastes, he said his imagination was baptized. He was walking into this world with this character, Anodos, right? This character on a journey, a pilgrim, as someone mentioned earlier when we were reading the scripture. We are pilgrims, and he recognized that in a way that he couldn't analyze and explain, but he felt it. And when Anodos returns from his journey, he has had an education in books. He spends a lot of time in this like magical, mystical library. He has an education through the stories that he has read have come alive. There's knights, and giants, and fighting, and towers, and the education goes with him. When he returns to the other world, he understands the world he lives in better. He seems to hear the trees as though they're talking the way they talk to him. And Lewis thought, oh, that could be true. And that was his first baptism. And then, of course, we know the story. Tolkien told him, well, it is true, right? If you know the story, Tolkien and Lewis are actually having this discussion over seeing the world through the eyes of myth or not. And Tolkien writes that really bad poem, All the Inklings Were Just Such Horrible Poets for some reason, in which they analyze being a myth lover or a myth hater. And Tolkien says the myth lover is able to look at the world and not destroy it and take it apart into its various pieces, but it sees everything as enchanted. And Lewis loved this. I mean, this is where we get Lewis's idea where he said, you've never met a mere mortal. If you could see your fellow human being in their true identity as these embodied souls, you'd want to bow down to them. It's a different way of imagining reality. So imagination should not be considered this escapist in the negative terms of escape, right? Where you distance yourself from this world and you wish you lived in Star Wars or something like that. But instead, imagination should help us see this reality better for what it actually is. And that's where Lewis began. And then he moves into the intellect and the discussion of the intellect. And one of the things that I think Lewis and Tolkien and a lot of our great imaginative writers knew is that you can't always get to people's intellect because of the phenomenology, because of the ways of viewing reality that are just kind of there, and most people don't know their assumptions about how they see the world. They've never questioned it. So an argument can't break through. So you look, for example, at someone like Ivan Karamazov, right? Kind of the great antagonist to the Christian faith. And he can't hear a refutation. In fact, Dostoevsky, if you've read that novel, Dostoevsky says there is no refutation to Ivan's complaints against God. I'm going to give you a little bit of a personal story. When I taught that passage a few years ago, I had miscarried a baby a week before. And my students are all sitting around intellectualizing the suffering of these mothers who don't have their children. And I had to tell them, this is not just an intellectual argument. This is a real thing. This is real suffering. Don't turn to a suffering person and tell them that they don't have a right to tell God, this is awful. This is bad. Yes, it is. And Dostoevsky was right. There is no argument against the badness of suffering. But because suffering is, because we are in a fallen world, you can either reject God, and everything's going to be more difficult. What happens in the novel to Ivan? His world becomes smaller, he becomes isolated, he becomes fractured as a self, and talks to this more miserable half of himself that's demonic and that tortures him from within. He becomes almost insane, closed in on himself, unable to get out of the argument, the intellectual argument against God. And what happens to Alyosha, his brother? He's complained to Alyosha. Alyosha's heard the argument and has fallen for it because, like I said, it's not a bad argument, it's a true argument. What should happen to those who kill children? And Alyosha says, shoot them. He's with Ivan in this. It's unjust what happens in our world. But what does his life do? Well, the very next section of the book is called The Life of Father Zosima. And it's a story within a story about the life of this great saint. The great saint that shows his whole narrative. He wasn't born into goodness and was always a great guy. The life of a saint doesn't look like that. Sanctification on earth doesn't look like that. In the Brothers Karamazov, instead what happens is you have Father Zosima witnessing the death of his brother, turning into this degenerate soldier until he has a wake-up call in his life in which he almost dies in a duel and converts to the faith. And then lives a life in which he takes responsibility of others' suffering upon himself. He responds with love to those who are hurting. He can't take away their suffering, and he doesn't try the way Ivan does and tortures himself into trying to remove it or fight against it or reject it. He loves them in it the way Christ did. He lays down on the ground before Dmitri, knowing that Dmitri's suffering. He recognizes the suffering in another human being and lays down as though I could take this upon myself, I would. Right? And then Alyosha sees, okay, if I have to choose a life, I can't argue, but if I have to imagine what narrative I want my story to be, my choice is to model Zosima and not to model Ivan. That's his choice. He learns from the story what kind of life does he want to live. And that's what we get to choose. What kind of story do we want to live? Now, if all the stories we're hearing are coming from the world, guess what kind of lives we're going to be living? And this is why Christians experience just as much fragmentation and disruption of self as every other American does. Because so many of the stories that you are inhabiting without thinking or intellectualizing through it, those stories are not true to what God has told you about who you are. And if God is telling you one story through the scripture and you're only hearing that every once in a while, but the rest of the world is telling you all these other stories, right? And it's really just written everywhere. It's from the time you have children. I watched Wreck-It Ralph. What a horrendous film, by the way. But this little girl is trying to find out who she is, and she looks in her reflection. Yeah, that's just the worst possible idea to teach a child. Know who you are with your own limited vision of yourself to decide who you are. I'm sorry, when I was a child growing up, if you would have told me to look in the mirror to discover like who I am and know myself, I would have been that is an ugly little fat girl that has no friends. That's a horrible way to tell children to find out who they are. It's just whoever you think you are. No, they need a narrative that says, you are fallen. Yes, you are hurting. Yes, you are broken. Yes, you may be ugly. You are blessed by God. He made you just the way you are for his purposes, for his glory. It's a different story. It's not looking in a pond, right? Or that Nutcracker movie, look inside yourself to find all your strengths. Heaven forbid I find my strength here. I would be so weak. I would be so lost. Can't find my strength here. It's a horrible narrative to tell children. So from the time they're very little, here we are worried about curse words and, you know, whether there's a bad guy. No, what is it telling them about who they are? What kind of stories is it teaching them to inhabit? That's what we need to look at from the time they're very young. And what kind of stories are we teaching in our schools that are telling them a different way of being in the world? We also have advertising, I think as Alan was talking about, we have advertising telling us stories. Let me tell you a humorous story. When my daughter was really little, she's 7 now, and when she was 2, she was really into Frozen. It had just come out. And they were selling chicken nuggets in the shape of Frozen characters in the store, which I just thought, I don't even know how that process would work, but it doesn't seem like a good idea for food. And so I was explaining to her, like, the outside looks really pretty. Looks like a wonderful thing. It's not going to be good inside. It's just manipulating you and trying to, and this to my 2-year-old, yes, this is exactly right. It's trying to trick you into buying this. It's lying to you, right? So then the whole time we're at the grocery store, Mom, it's tricking me. More stuff is tricking me. It's tricking me. But I think we do have to be counterformational in a different kind of story because they're just being barraged with these, that's not the right word, but berated with all these different stories about who they are and who they're supposed to be. So how do we counteract that? Well, I have made a lot of arguments that it seems like the most common stories we tell are ones about worldly success, even within the Christian church. We are telling students that they need to get good grades. We are telling students they need to get good jobs, whatever that actually means, right? I don't think it means that they need to be Mother Teresa in Calcutta, but I think that's a great job. They need to make money, have accomplishments. That's a story that most of us don't even know we're telling. And yet we are, in all of our little ways of enacting this story with one another. More explicit, I would say, are the stories like superhero narratives. Now, I like the Marvel Universe. It's so funny when I start talking against superhero stories, especially because I mostly speak on college campuses, that students tell me I don't know what I'm talking about. I will go toe-to-toe with you on the Marvel Universe, okay? I know what I'm talking about, but I also counteract the amount of Marvel that I watch with reading way better stories. And I spend most of my time reading better stories so that I can actually place the Marvel Universe where it rightly deserves in this small pocket of my life called entertainment, not in the larger sphere of defining who I am. And what I have a problem with is this larger sphere in which we have allowed our time to be dominated by these stories. It's all we do. And maybe this doesn't speak to adults as much, or I shouldn't say adults, maybe it doesn't speak to post-30-year-olds, as I don't know, as much as it does to the generations, and I don't know their names. I always forget the generations' names. But the lower 20 to 30-year-olds, because it seems like from what I've heard, there's much more of your life that is spent streaming. You could pick up your phone and say that you've been on there for like 5 hours on average a day, is what my students tell me, right? That they're streaming more than they're reading, which means the stories they're inhabiting are largely cultivated just to feed exactly who they think they are, right? It's telling them what they want to hear about themselves. Most of the movies are telling them what they want to hear about themselves. And the superhero movies are great at this. I watch Wonder Woman and yes, I want to kick butt. Like that music comes on, I'm like, yes, I gotta see myself, right? I want to like take out all the bad guys and beat them all up. But that's actually that's not the Christian call. Just FYI, if you didn't know that. That's not the Christian call. The Christian call is go to the cross. Go to the cross. Be crucified. Die. Don't be the hero. Don't be the name. Don't chase after all the power. Be a hobbit. Be a nobody. That's the Christian story. And I would say the way we counteract all these other stories is to read the great stories we've inherited. I've spent most of my time over the last couple of years really focused on contemporary stories. What are the great novels in which we see characters actually doing this? And if we are living in these worlds, if we're living in novels like this, like Fantasties, like Lewis was with Fantasties, what kind of baptism of the imagination might we experience that would counteract any of the modern dispositions like Lewis had that we inhabited without realizing it? I'm going to give you an example of one of the stories that I've been writing on recently, The Diary of a Country Priest. So this is a 1930s novel, and I'm focusing on this one for two reasons. One, because it goes against my brain. It is a novel that I don't pick up to read because I love everything about it. It doesn't entertain me. If you actually talk about the plot of this novel, this is going to sound like I'm not selling the novel. Please go read this novel. The plot of the novel is a priest who feels inept, and the whole town thinks he's bad at what he's doing, and he dies of stomach cancer. Yay! But what it teaches you to do is to see differently. If we are supposed to imagine the way God sees us, right? Which of course we don't want to get into God's head or pretend that we understand God's vision. I'm not asking for arrogance. I'm asking for the opposite. I'm asking for a place that you're going to inhabit that's mysterious, in which you feel like you don't know most of the ways that God sees. But if we're trying to imagine a different set of eyes, to see the invisible things happening, the spiritual reality, that's what this book does. Just one example. He's writing a diary. We get to see his inner life in the pages. We get to hear his prayers. And he keeps talking about, I'm so bad at praying. But we're reading his prayers and thinking, like, if you're bad at praying, what am I? I must be so much worse at praying than I ever knew, because his prayers are beautiful and they feel powerful. And we as readers have enough distance that we see fruit being born in the community in ways that he cannot. And so it reminds us once again that we're always doing more good by God's grace than we even know. It's not about the success or the resume or getting to look like the best priest, right? Or the best Christian. It's about the things that are unseen that this novel gets you to attend to. Let me give you one example. He goes to meet with this woman, and she is high and mighty in the community. She's an aristocrat. She has great standing, and she's been doing her duty for years in this community. And he doesn't even mean to talk to her necessarily about her. He had no intention. And this is, again, where you see God at work in ways that he didn't even realize, right? The priest doesn't. He goes to talk about her daughter. He thinks her daughter's suicidal. He wants to help. And instead, the conversation, God just takes over. And he says, I found myself praying in every moment. Throughout this conversation, he can't stop praying in this moment. And as he's praying and they're having this conversation, she's laughing at him. Imagine that kind of humility. And yet he looks at her and he's like, I'm not saying any of this. And he's so clumsy in his words, so awkward, kind of like Moses, right? Where Moses says, like, I don't have the words to go into Egypt. You have to send somebody else. You notice the priest doesn't have the words, and yet God is using his ineptness in these circumstances. And he says, I'm not saying this. I'm no better than the fire poker in your hand. That's what I am to God, a mere instrument he's using. And as they're conversing, he tries to get her to say the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come, he says repeatedly. I will, and she says, I can't. I can't admit to his will. Why? Because she lost a son when he was 18 months. And she suddenly reveals this to him and hasn't told very many people. Hardly anyone knows outside their family about this big loss that they've just been hiding away in their family to themselves. And she's been reserved and serene and doing her Christian duty and the whole time hating God for taking it away from her. Took her son. She'd rather be in hell with her son than be in the presence of such a God. And in this conversation, he gets her to let go of that hatred. He talks to her about God's love. He said, if you want to see your son, you have to love God. And he says, the reason why is your son won't know you. Because he knew a mother who loved him. If you hold on to hate, you'll have no love. And he won't even recognize you. When he sees you, he'll run away from you. She had never imagined it that way. Never saw that that could be the case after life. And suddenly that draw to her son makes her lay down her burden. She has a necklace that has her son's hair in it. She throws it into the fire and says, I give everything. Drops to her knees, that will be done with. And completely gives it up. She writes a letter to him and says, I feel peace. I feel hope for the first time. You're such a child. You said everything wrong. You did everything wrong. But God showed me how to have peace again. So thank you. She dies. And he looks at her the next day, realizing that was God's plan the entire time, to bring her to that moment so she would be reunited with her son and not lost forever. And he said, may she keep that peace forever. It will be that I gave it to her. Oh, a miracle, thus to be able to give what we ourselves do not possess, the miracle of empty hands. For someone who struggles with prayer, who struggles with attention, I struggle with the contemplation that I know is so important, to be still, to be silent, to not care about what people think about you, to have solitude, an extrovert. This novel hurts in the way it reshapes me. But I long to be able to do what the priest did. I know I have empty hands, and they're going to stay empty, being able to give nothing unless I follow his example. And I let God do miraculous things with these empty hands. So I need these novels to form me in such a way that I'm ready to do that. And I can't do it by just reading this novel one time. I have to read it multiple times. I have to read other novels like this multiple times. But that's the great joy of a Christian life, is that we know we're not where we need to be. We know we cannot get to look like Christ by ourselves, but we have all of these saints, and I'm using that term very lowercase, but we have all these saints like Bernanos and his priest to help us, to accompany us. That's the different story that's being told, is that you are part of a larger story that began way before Bernanos, that began with creation. But Bernanos is part of it. His priest, I believe, is part of it, just like we believe Nicholas Tree is hopefully there. And now we get to tell stories, and if we want them to be true and we want them to be beautiful, and if we want to tell stories with our very lives that are true and beautiful, then I think we need to join these saints in their company and be part of that story. Thank you. Do you have time for questions or no?
We do. We have a few minutes if anyone has questions for
Barbara. Dr. Wilson,
Yes.
I am doing some writing on a particular page in Surprised by Joy. It's the page that you referenced where he talks about being baptized after reading Fantastic. And he focuses on one word in that section, and that word is holiness. And I have been really contemplating what to mean, just trying to dig deeper in what did C.S. Lewis mean by, Fantastic and that whole thing, calling him to holiness. Would you mind giving your thoughts on it?
Sure. I mean, the title of the book is The Scandal of Holiness. So what I think holiness means to be set apart. And what has happened with a lot of Christianity is we have not been set apart. We should be, but instead we have given up most of what set us apart for fear of legalism, right? So spiritual practices, weird things like thinking it's the body and blood of Jesus, different things that would actually make us look weird and different in the world, right? Giving up stuff, being ascetic, the idea of being ascetic is just so antithetical to us, right? And I think what Lewis sees in this book is here you have someone who's actually pursuing a way that is completely set apart. It's actually in a different world. But that's what Christians should be doing. We should be inhabiting this different world even while we're here. That's what being set apart would look like. We are so concerned with the things of God, the things of this world look trivial. Not that they don't matter, right? And the incarnation shows us that this world matters, but that we are always being guided by the things that are higher, that this world is aspiring or hopefully participating in redemption to be. And it's a mysterious process. But I think that's what Lewis is getting at with holiness in Anodos, is that he was living by a different world, a different way of seeing. He was being set apart.
As a follow-up, do you think, now some places it says he was 16 when he picked that book up, and some say he was 18 at the train station when he picked that book up. Do you think that that's why he just couldn't really at that moment give his life to Christianity or to that because it was too much holiness?
No, I don't. So I think he would have had to have been 16 because then he went to Oxford. So so I think he would have been a teenager. But the book itself baptized his imagination as he looks back on that moment. In that moment, the teenage boy, I don't think had any consideration for his imagination being baptized, right? He sensed something he couldn't explain that I don't know how old he is, 40-year-old Lewis looks back and says, that was holiness that was attractive to me. Right? That's what the otherworldliness is. It's a set apartness of being like God. But I didn't see it there at that time. Right? So it was more of the imagination, something that he felt, something that called to his heart, something that he sensed, that he couldn't yet explain. Once he could, and once Tolkien told him that world was not just fantasy, that is the real way of seeing our world, then everything clicked for him, and he had to go back and look at experiences in his life under that new vision. Yeah. Yes, Jennifer, and then Michael.
Yeah. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to phrase this well.
The ineffable.
At the end of your talk, I love this image that you've called us to think of about, how Niggle's tree is in a sense realer than being recognized, and for you, this priest in this book is in a sense real, even though he's also fictional. And it reminds me of a conversation I had with a friend once where we were sort of talking about the difference between our sort of contemporary, what we're taught about, like the solar system, right, and the medieval cosmos. And I think I made the comment about, I believe what they taught me in fifth grade science about the solar system, but I don't love it like I love the medieval cosmos. And so I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit more on kind of this tension in maybe the Christian imagination between what is like materially real and things that I think are real in a different sense, or sort of true, larger sense, and just
I think Chesterton is so helpful for that, because orthodoxy is all about the practical romance, so the practice of a life that is romantic and not capital R romantic, right? But where you see the world around you and like, it's green. Like grass doesn't have to be green, but it's green, right? Like Alan was talking about the red leaf, like how cool that is to the child's imagination, but that's an imagination we can hold on to, right? The sun is not the center of, or it is, but the different medieval cosmos, like the earth is not the center of things anymore, but that doesn't mean that the earth isn't grand, that it doesn't have this great place in the rest of the cosmos, right? It doesn't mean that we can't try to understand it and love it for everything that it is. And I think that's what Chesterton is trying to do in orthodoxy, is tell you, like, how do you practice that enchanted vision of things on a regular, like, day-to-day life, like looking at the mundane? How do we get excited when a door opens, the way a 2-year-old gets excited when the door opens, right? And trying to hold on to those ways of seeing our world. But there is a tension, and there is, but I don't know, the more I read about science too, the more excited I get. So I do think there's enchantment even in the science. I mean, Francis Collins became a Christian by going through the human genome, right? Like, there's something too about the more you know about mathematics and science that can give you a greater enchanted vision of the world. It doesn't have to take it apart. It can actually add to that. Robbie Jane is really good on this. Caldecott, Stratford Caldecott is really good on this. So there's some writers of math and science, I think, too, that can help that vision, so it doesn't have to be so empirical and derived of spirit. Michael?
I guess this is actually sort of related to that. How important do you think experience is to imagination in our connection with other people's imagination? Like you shared your story about how what you had experienced opened up something your students could not see.
Yeah.
Or I think about my students who haven't experienced a lot of life other than through their streaming.
Right. So Lewis talks about you can live without reading books, but the world you live is very small. He said, for me, it would be a prison to live in such a world. Experience will provide you a certain amount of ways of seeing the world. Like the longer you live, there are things that you will learn just going through life. But there's an intentional expansion of that vision that happens in reading. So at the end of an experiment in criticism, Lewis says, in reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with myriad eyes, yet it is still I who sees. So what happens with reading is that it just expands your experience, so that I know what it was like to fight in the Trojan War in some sense. It doesn't mean that there's a great book on Achilles in Vietnam. It doesn't mean that those who fought in Vietnam are not going to be able to add to my understanding of that reading because of their experiences, because they can. because we're all bringing in certain ways or responding to text with experience. But the reading itself can add to our experiences. We get to live more lives and more perspectives than we ever could by ourselves. I think we're meant to do that.